Hi, everybody, and welcome to Chapter 1 of Introduction to Criminal Justice. So the first thing we're going to start out with is introducing the two competing elements that I always say they're constantly warring in the criminal justice system. And that is finding the balance between the need for social order and public safety against the need to also protect individual liberties and rights. And it is this sort of balancing act that results in two different models of justice. The first is titled the due process model of criminal justice. And that is the perspective that's going to place a high emphasis and value on individual rights, liberties, fair process, fair function of the criminal justice system. The idea here behind the due process system or the due process model is that it's better to let 10 guilty people go than it is to let one innocent person be incarcerated wrongfully. The opposite perspective is the crime control model. And this is a perspective that places higher emphasis and value on the ideas of arrest and conviction of criminal offenders. These two approaches are often seen as sort of polar opposites or that they're at odds with one another. The due process model argues that too much emphasis on crime control results in the violation of individual rights and liberties, while the crime control model often argues that too much emphasis on rights and liberties results in putting people in the way of crime, that it increases victimization. Criminals are being put before society and safety and victims. And those are the two perspectives, and they're sort of constantly pulling and pushing on each other. Despite the fact that they're often seen as polar opposites or warring factions, so to speak, both models have the same focus, and that focus is social control. So let's talk about, or let's define social control. What is social control? Social control is the use of sanctions and rewards to shape behavior towards pro-social expectations. So when somebody breaks a rule that we as society have defined as, unacceptable behavior, we apply a sanction. When you break a law, which is a rule, there's some sort of punishment, and it's an attempt to alter your behavior to minimize you from doing this again in the future. So, like I said, we achieve social control through the creation of laws and statutes that dictate what is and is not acceptable behavior in society. These laws and statutes function around the balancing act of respecting freedoms and rights, and provide limits as to what can and can't be done by the government, also, i.e., known as law enforcement. There's something that is called the social contract, which is what underscores social control. And that social contract is where it's an implicit agreement. Nobody writes it down, nobody talks about it, but it exists in all societies. It exists in our society and in each one of us. And that's the exchange of freedom for safety at the hands of the government. So in return to say, hey, government, and police, you keep me safe. You arrest the bad guys when they break the law and make sure that they don't continue to break the law and harm me and my fellow community members. I'm willing to give up a little bit of my freedoms in order for you to do that. And that's the contract, that I'm willing to give up a little bit of my freedoms to let you come in here and enforce the law. Right. But this begs the question that how much of a sacrifice of freedom is too much of a sacrifice before to provide safety, before the sacrifice becomes too much, before people start to feel oppressed, before people feel as if they have lost their rights. So in comes a really important term that you should know throughout your term in this class and just in criminal justice in general, in life in general, which is due process. And that's where due process comes in, right? That each and every person who is suspected of or accused of a crime here in the United States is granted a right called due process of law. And what that means is there's a litany or a list of rights that each and every single one of us is guaranteed under the Constitution that are our protections when we are accused of a crime, whether rightfully or wrongfully. And we are guaranteed that the government will abide by these protections and provide all of these protections to us as we navigate the criminal justice system. So what are these rights? What do they look like? Well, you know them more popularly by the phrase the Bill of Rights, right? And we're going to go through most, but not all of them, okay, that you need to know for the exam and just in general, just generally as a citizen, and so you can exercise your own rights. The first, everybody knows, it's sort of the go-to, if you will. It's freedom of speech, press, religion, and the right to assemble peacefully to protest. Number two is the right to bear arms. It tends to be a controversial amendment. It was originally intended as a way of keeping the government in check so that if the citizenry is armed and the government becomes oppressive, the citizenry can organize into a militia and fight an oppressive government. And it is a system of checks and balances on the government. Number three, I just throw it out there because it's kind of interesting, but it's completely sort of dead in the water. You have the right not to quarter soldiers in your house. This is a really antiquated right that comes from the colonial days, before we were an independent country, that the King of England could send people over here and say, hey, colonists, you have to feed and house our troops on your own dime. So while that is really not relevant to today, it's just sort of a fun thing to know. Number four is my favorite, and that's the right against illegal search and seizure. And what this does is it protects you from the government or law enforcement coming into your home and searching or seizing evidence illegally. That there must be a requirement here for a warrant, right? Or probable cause has to be present depending on where you are. Your expectation of privacy varies depending on where you are. You don't have the same expectation of privacy in your house or in your car as you do in your house, etc. It's very different. There's a lot of case law that covers this that we will be hitting upon throughout the term. But the idea here is that there's a limit on the government. There's a limit on law enforcement. You can't just come into my house, look around, and take whatever you want because I have the right to privacy. I have that protection through the Fourth Amendment. Number five, the Fifth Amendment is the right against self-incrimination, against double jeopardy, and it provides you due process of law. You do not have to speak to anything that could possibly incriminate you. You have that right. You can exercise your Fifth Amendment and remain silent, right? You have the right against double jeopardy that if you have been tried of a crime, convicted or acquitted, you can never be tried for that crime again. And not every country in the world offers that protection. There are some countries where you can be tried again and again and again for the same crime if the state doesn't like the outcome. And of course, the last element of that Fifth Amendment is due process. It's literally an amendment that guarantees you your Bill of Rights. Number six is the right to a public and speedy trial, the right to representation, the right to confront and cross-examine your accuser, and the right of notice of charges against you. So that if somebody does accuse you of a crime and you have to enter the formal criminal justice system, you have representation, you have the right to a speedy trial so that you're not languishing in prison or pretrial detention for 5 years before you finally get your day in court. And of course, you have the right to notice the charges against you. You have the right to know what somebody's accusing you of having done. Number seven is the right to a jury trial in federal civil cases. Number eight is the right against excessive bail and fines and the right against cruel and unusual punishment. Number nine simply states that people have rights above and beyond the Bill of Rights. Number 10 is a tricky one. I mean, it's an issue that we're going to hit repeatedly throughout the term. It's known as federalism. Federalism is a fancy way of saying states' rights. And what that means is every state in the union has the ability to manage its citizenry as they see fit. Now, there is an exception to that. You cannot, through federalism or states' right, negate federal law. Federal law is the law of the land. It's the umbrella of law that covers every state in the union. But anything that's not legislated at the federal level, well, it's up to each state how they want to legislate that law, right? So if it's federal law, everybody has to, adhere to it. But if it's not federal law, if it's not already been legislated at the federal level, each state has a right to decide how they want to handle those laws, make something legal, make something illegal, according to the culture of their state. Right. So certainly there are things that are legal in certain states that aren't legal in other states because maybe the residents of Colorado are comfortable with this, but the residents of Ohio are not. Right. That's federalism. The freedom for the states to legislate as they see fit outside, above and beyond federal law. And finally, we're going to throw in number 14, the 14th Amendment, just because it's really important. This is the Equal Protection Clause that states that all laws are applied equally to all people, regardless of race, economic status, religion, gender, sexuality, etc. And this is where they send home like a whammy, right? It reiterates due process. It reminds everybody, hey, everybody gets due process. everybody, regardless of race, sex, religion, etc. So you get due process guaranteed to you by two amendments, number 5 and number 14, because it's that important. And due process is simply the guarantee and the execution of all the rights that I've just gone through. Keep in mind that these rights are specific to the United States. I really like my students to know that these rights do not follow you when you leave the United States. So be aware of that when you travel and be cognizant of where you break the law. So that's very important, but let's move on. Okay. How do we go about determining what is legal and illegal? And that usually comes from something called evidence-based practice. Evidence-based practice is an element that drives a lot of everything in the criminal justice system. So I want you to know what it is. That pretty much it's we gather data and we measure policy, procedure, and we say, does it have the intended impact? Does it minimize crime? Does it decrease crime? Or did crime increase while we use this policy? We drive our policies, we drive our legislation, we drive our laws, our sanctions, etc., through evidence-based research, which comes from social science research, which is something you probably all learned about in high school without even realizing it, where you develop a research question and a hypothesis, and then you test the hypothesis through numeric data or qualitative data, and then you write up the findings, create a report, it gets peer reviewed, and then it gets published and disseminated. Right. And ultimately, all of that evidence-based research and that social science research becomes an issue or an area of study that we call criminology, right? Which is the scientific study of causes, prevention, treatments, and sanctions that look to minimize criminality. It's evidence-based. It has to have support. It has to have something tangible, and it looks to decrease crime and provide more protection. So please go over all of your materials for week 1 to shore up all of these concepts. And as always, if you have questions or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out.